My friends convinced her I wasn't good enough right after she said yes to my proposal. I thought 3 years together meant something, but apparently their opinions mattered more than our entire relationship history. The whole thing still feels like some twisted nightmare where the best moment of my life got transformed into the worst in the span of 20 minutes by 3 women who'd never liked me anyway. I'd spent months planning the perfect proposal at the Contemporary Art Museum in Austin, where we'd had our first date during a sculpture exhibition opening, researching every detail to make sure the evening would be meaningful rather than just expensive or flashy. Nicole had always appreciated thoughtfulness over grand gestures, which was part of what made her so different from the women her friends typically dated, guys with flashy cars and bigger bank accounts but no real substance underneath all the surface appeal. I'd been secretly working with her favorite local artist, Marcus Rivera, for 6 weeks straight, commissioning a custom mixed media piece that incorporated elements from every major milestone in our relationship: the vintage coffee shop sign from the place where we met, pressed flowers from the hiking trail where we first said I love you, even fragments from that little ceramic owl she'd insisted on keeping when we moved from her studio apartment into our shared place downtown. The piece was scheduled to be unveiled during the gallery's evening reception, and I'd coordinated with the curator to time my proposal perfectly with the reveal, imagining how Nicole's face would light up when she realized the artwork was ours. Our story transformed into something beautiful and permanent that we could hang in our future home. The evening reception was everything I'd hoped for: soft lighting casting dramatic shadows across the white gallery walls while well-dressed couples moved quietly between installations, wine glasses clinking softly as people discussed the artistic merit of various pieces in hushed, reverent tones that made the space feel sacred rather than pretentious. Nicole wore her favorite navy dress, the one that brought out her eyes, and kept asking why I seemed so nervous as we moved through the exhibition, examining sculptures and paintings while I kept checking my watch and trying to steer us toward the back corner where our piece waited behind its black velvet drape. When the curator finally announced the special unveiling and pulled away the fabric, Nicole gasped and covered her mouth with both hands, recognizing immediately that every element had personal significance, tears forming in her eyes as she realized what I'd done and why I'd been so secretive about this particular gallery opening. I'd rehearsed this moment countless times in my head, practicing what I'd say and how I'd position myself, but actually dropping to one knee in front of our commissioned artwork felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold while my heart hammered so hard I was sure everyone in the gallery could hear it. She said yes immediately, not even letting me finish my carefully planned speech before pulling me up to kiss her while tears streamed down her face, and for about 10 perfect minutes I felt like the luckiest man alive, watching her examine every detail of our piece while other guests approached to offer congratulations and ask about the story behind the artwork. Then Sarah, Jessica, and Amanda appeared as if summoned by some cruel twist of fate, claiming they just happened to be in the neighborhood and thought they'd stop by to see the exhibition, which should have been my first obvious clue that their presence was carefully orchestrated rather than coincidental, since none of them had ever shown interest in art before. They immediately surrounded Nicole like protective wolves, exclaiming over her ring with fake enthusiasm while shooting me looks that ranged from skeptical to openly hostile, and within minutes they'd managed to pull her aside for what they called a quick bathroom break to touch up makeup and hear all the proposal details. I stood there for 20 agonizing minutes making increasingly awkward small talk with Marcus and the curator while watching the bathroom door like an absolute fool, trying to convince myself that everything was fine while a sick feeling grew in my stomach as the minutes ticked by and muffled voices carried through the restroom door. When they finally emerged, Nicole's carefully applied mascara was streaked down her cheeks and her hands were visibly shaking as she approached me with an expression that looked like she was walking to her own execution, holding out the ring I'd spent 2 months' salary on like it was contaminated with something toxic. She explained in this flat, emotionless voice that didn't sound anything like the woman who'd been crying tears of joy 20 minutes earlier that her friends had helped her realize we weren't compatible long-term and she couldn't ignore their concerns anymore, parroting phrases that sounded suspiciously like Sarah's typical relationship advice mixed with Jessica's opinions about ambitious men and Amanda's theories about settling for safe choices. I could have demanded explanations, could have asked what specific concerns they'd raised or why their opinions suddenly mattered more than 3 years of building something real together, Could have fought for our relationship right there in front of everyone, but standing in that gallery surrounded by strangers who'd witnessed our entire emotional train wreck unfold like performance art, I just took the ring back and told her it was her choice to make. Her friends stood behind her looking simultaneously triumphant and uncomfortable, like they'd won a contest they weren't entirely sure they'd wanted to enter, while Nicole started crying harder as I turned and walked away without looking back, leaving behind the woman I'd planned to marry and the commissioned artwork that would forever remind her of what she'd thrown away. I drove straight to my cousin Danny's apartment across town that night and spent the entire weekend processing what had just happened while Nicole's friends desperately tried to justify their intervention by creating an elaborate list of my supposed character flaws to console her through what they kept calling her moment of temporary weakness. Danny let me crash on his couch without asking too many probing questions, just handed me a beer and said sometimes people show you exactly who they really are when you least expect it, which was probably the most genuine wisdom anyone had offered me in months of navigating Nicole's increasingly complicated social dynamics. By Sunday evening, I'd already started seriously browsing job opportunities in other cities across the country, having reached the uncomfortable but necessary realization that staying in Austin meant permanently navigating a social circle that would always view me as fundamentally inadequate and would probably continue undermining any future relationship I tried to build there. I wasn't running away from confrontation exactly, but I also wasn't naive enough to think Nicole's friends would suddenly develop genuine respect for me or stop systematically poisoning her against any man who didn't meet their impossible standards of excitement, financial success, and social status that seemed to change based on their current mood. When Sarah called me Monday morning with obvious nervousness in her voice to explain they'd just been looking out for Nicole's best interests as loyal friends should, I listened politely while she rattled off their carefully rehearsed concerns about my supposed lack of ambition, my preference for quiet evenings over expensive nightclub adventures, and my apparent inability to provide the kind of luxury lifestyle Nicole truly deserved, whatever that actually meant coming from someone whose own relationship history consisted entirely of dramatic breakups and ongoing financial disasters with men who treated her like garbage. I told Sarah calmly that if Nicole genuinely valued their collective opinions over her own feelings about our 3-year relationship and everything we'd built together through good times and challenges, then maybe they'd been absolutely right to end it, though I privately suspected they'd done her significantly more psychological harm than good by systematically teaching her to doubt her own judgment and emotional instincts. Sarah seemed genuinely surprised by my measured, rational response, like she'd expected me to beg desperately for another chance or promise to transform myself into whoever they thought Nicole needed, but I'd already realized that trying to win approval from people who'd fundamentally disliked me from day one was a completely losing game that would only make everyone involved progressively more miserable. Meanwhile, according to mutual friends, Nicole's self-appointed protectors were apparently working overtime to reinforce their hasty decision by painting increasingly dramatic pictures of the supposed bullet she dodged, telling her I would have inevitably become controlling and boring once we were legally married, that I clearly lacked the drive and ambition to give her the exciting, adventure-filled life she deserved, and that she needed someone who would consistently sweep her off her feet, with spontaneous adventures and expensive surprises rather than my apparently inadequate offerings of thoughtful gestures and steady, reliable partnership. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me that these same women had spent the past several years cycling through relationships with exactly the kind of men they claimed Nicole needed: flashy, superficially charming guys who treated them terribly but looked impressive on social media, while consistently ending up disappointed, bitter, and financially drained when the initial excitement wore off and harsh reality inevitably set in. They began to feel the first pangs of genuine guilt by Wednesday when Nicole stopped answering their increasingly frantic texts and called in sick to work for 3 consecutive days, but instead of honestly admitting they might have made a serious mistake, they doubled down on their intervention by organizing elaborate girls' nights and expensive shopping trips specifically designed to distract her from what they kept dismissively calling her temporary sadness over losing someone who wasn't right for her anyway. Within a month of that disastrous gallery night, I'd accepted a position with Henderson and Associates, a prestigious architectural firm in Charleston that specialized in historic preservation and sustainable design, and I immediately began the emotionally exhausting but necessary process of completely relocating my entire life 3 states away from the toxicity I was leaving behind. The job offer had come through a former professor who'd remembered my thesis on adaptive reuse of historic buildings, and the timing felt like the universe finally throwing me a lifeline after weeks of questioning everything about my judgment and self-worth. I sold most of my furniture to a young couple just starting out, broke my lease early and paid the penalty without complaint, and systematically began erasing every trace of my Austin existence except for the few meaningful possessions that would fit in my Honda Civic for the drive east. Nicole's friends initially celebrated their supposed success in saving her from what Sarah kept calling the mistake of settling for someone who would never challenge her to grow, but their victory celebration felt increasingly hollow and uncomfortable as they watched her spiral deeper into a depression that seemed to worsen rather than improve with each passing day. She'd stopped participating in their usual group activities entirely, declining invitations to their weekly brunches and book club meetings with increasingly flimsy excuses that fooled no one, and when they forced her to join them for drinks, she'd sit quietly nursing a single glass of wine while they tried desperately to engage her in conversations about anything except relationships or future plans. When Sarah accidentally mentioned during their Thursday book club that she'd heard through mutual friends that I was moving to South Carolina permanently rather than just taking some time to cool off, Nicole had what could only be described as a complete emotional breakdown, sobbing uncontrollably as the finality of her decision hit her like a physical blow and she realized there would be no opportunity for reconciliation or second chances. Her friends exchanged worried, guilty glances across the coffee shop table while other customers stared at the crying woman who seemed to be having some kind of personal crisis in public, and for the first time since the museum incident, they began seriously questioning whether their intervention had been motivated by genuine concern for Nicole's happiness or by their own jealousy and need to control her choices. They tried frantically to convince Nicole that she should fight for our relationship now that they could see her genuine anguish, suggesting she could call me or even fly to Charleston to explain that she'd made a terrible mistake, but Nicole's pride had been too thoroughly damaged by the humiliation of rejecting a proposal based on her friends' opinions rather than her own feelings. She told them through tears that she couldn't bear the thought of admitting she'd let them manipulate her into destroying the best relationship she'd ever had, that she'd thrown away 3 years of genuine love and partnership because she'd been too weak to trust her own heart over their collective judgment about what kind of man she deserved. I changed my phone number during my last week in Austin, deleted all my social media accounts, and specifically asked my family members not to share any information about my whereabouts or new life with anyone from my previous social circle, effectively cutting all ties with a chapter of my life that had taught me valuable but painful lessons about the importance of surrounding yourself with people who genuinely want you to be happy. My parents were supportive of the move once I explained the situation, though my mother expressed disappointment that Nicole had allowed outside influences to override her own feelings about a relationship that had seemed so solid and promising from the outside. The drive to Charleston took 2 days, and I used the time to mentally process everything that had happened, listening to podcasts about starting over and rebuilding your life while watching the landscape change from Texas plains to southern coastal lowlands, symbolically leaving behind not just a geographic location but an entire identity built around trying to be good enough for people who would never truly accept me. By the time I reached Charleston's historic district and saw the centuries-old buildings that would become my new professional focus, I felt lighter than I had in months, ready to build a life based on my own values rather than constantly seeking approval from people whose standards seemed designed to ensure disappointment. The apartment I'd rented sight unseen turned out to be a converted carriage house behind a Victorian mansion, complete with original brick walls and enough character to remind me daily that some things become more beautiful and valuable with age rather than less, which felt like exactly the kind of metaphor I needed as I began this unexpected new chapter of my life. In Charleston, I threw myself completely into designing sustainable housing projects that preserved the historic character of neighborhoods while incorporating modern environmental technologies, finding genuine fulfillment in work that felt meaningful rather than just financially necessary, and I joined the Ashley River Sailing Club where I slowly built a new social circle of people who appreciated my thoughtful, steady personality that Nicole's friends had consistently criticized as boring and unambitious. The sailing club members were mostly professionals in their 30s and 40s who valued competence and reliability over flashiness, and they welcomed my systematic approach to learning navigation and boat maintenance without making me feel like I needed to prove my worth through expensive gear or dramatic sailing stories. My new colleagues at Henderson and Associates were equally refreshing, treating my methodical design process and attention to detail as professional assets rather than signs of being overly cautious or lacking creativity, and within 6 months I was leading a team designing affordable housing that incorporated solar panels and rainwater collection systems into historically accurate architectural frameworks. I started therapy with Dr. Patricia Williams, a no-nonsense psychologist who helped me understand why I'd allowed myself to stay in a relationship where outside opinions held more weight than our actual compatibility and personal happiness. And through our sessions I began recognizing patterns of people-pleasing behavior that had made me vulnerable to manipulation by Nicole's controlling friends. After 8 months of focusing entirely on rebuilding my professional and social life, I began dating casually, meeting women through sailing club events and community volunteer projects who were impressed by my emotional maturity and genuine interest in building partnerships rather than just having someone attractive to display on social media. Meanwhile, according to the occasional updates that filtered through mutual connections, Nicole's friend group was disintegrating into an increasingly toxic mess of blame shifting and resentment as they struggled to deal with the aftermath of their intervention and its devastating impact on Nicole's mental health and self-confidence. Sarah and Jessica had apparently begun openly arguing about whose idea the museum bathroom confrontation had originally been, with each trying to shift responsibility for the decision that had clearly backfired spectacularly. While Amanda had started distancing herself from the group entirely after witnessing Nicole's continued deterioration and recognizing her own role in destroying what had obviously been a healthy, loving relationship. Nicole herself was cycling through a series of rebound relationships with men who met her friend's criteria for excitement and financial success but treated her with the casual disrespect that seemed to come naturally to guys who prioritized their own entertainment over genuine partnership. And each failed relationship only reinforced her growing realization that she'd thrown away something irreplaceable for the approval of people who didn't actually have her best interests at heart. She'd started therapy as well, though her progress was apparently hampered by her friends' continued involvement in her life and their persistent attempts to justify their actions rather than acknowledge the damage they'd caused. And she was slowly beginning to understand how Mason must have felt being constantly judged and criticized by people who had never bothered to actually know him as a person rather than as a convenient target for their own insecurities and failed relationships. The group dynamic that had once seemed supportive and protective was now revealed as fundamentally toxic, built on competition, jealousy, and a shared need to tear down anyone who threatened their narrative that all men were disappointing and that settling for steady, reliable love was a form of giving up on your dreams rather than finding something genuinely valuable. Nicole began resenting their constant commentary on every aspect of her dating life, finally understanding how suffocating their opinions had been and recognizing that their supposed protection had actually been a form of control designed to keep her single and available as their emotional support system rather than building her own independent happiness with someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. She started declining their invitations more frequently, making excuses to avoid their group gatherings where they would inevitably analyze her choices and offer unsolicited advice about men they'd never bothered to get to know. And she found herself missing the peaceful evenings she'd shared with me when we could just exist together without constantly performing for an audience or justifying our relationship to people who seemed determined to find fault with anything that didn't match their unrealistic expectations of romance and partnership. 2 years after establishing my new life in Charleston, I met Claire Morrison, a sustainable energy consultant who shared my passion for environmental architecture and valued independence over group consensus in decision-making, and our relationship developed naturally without the constant interference and commentary that had poisoned my previous attempt at building something meaningful with someone I genuinely cared about. Claire was refreshingly self-possessed, making her own decisions about everything from career moves to weekend plans without needing to poll her friends for approval, and she found my loyalty and emotional maturity attractive rather than boring, appreciating that I showed love through consistent actions rather than dramatic gestures designed for social media validation. We met at a green building conference where she was presenting research on integrating solar technology into historic preservation projects, and I was immediately impressed by her expertise and confidence as she fielded technical questions from architects and engineers who clearly respected her knowledge and innovative approaches to sustainable design. Our first few dates involved long conversations about shared professional interests and personal values, and I felt relief at being with someone who formed her own opinions about people and situations rather than deferring to friends who seemed more interested in drama than genuine happiness for the people they claimed to care about. When I posted photos from our first vacation together to Savannah's historic district, where we'd spent a long weekend exploring antebellum architecture while discussing adaptive reuse possibilities for historic buildings, Nicole discovered my Instagram account through a mutual college friend we'd both forgotten was still connected to us on social media, and she saw firsthand how genuinely happy and relaxed I looked with someone who clearly supported and celebrated my interests rather than merely tolerating them. She screenshot the photos and showed them to her remaining friends, who immediately went into damage control mode by insisting that Claire looked uptight and controlling, that my smile seemed forced, and that rebound relationships never lasted anyway, but Nicole was finally beginning to see through their transparent jealousy and recognize how they'd been projecting their own relationship failures onto her choices for years. The contrast between their bitter commentary and the obvious contentment in my vacation photos was stark enough to make Nicole question every relationship decision they'd influenced over the years, and she started recognizing a clear pattern of sabotage disguised as protection whenever she'd been involved with men who treated her well and offered genuine stability rather than the exciting dysfunction her friends seemed to prefer for themselves and everyone around them. Claire and I had traveled to Savannah specifically to research sustainable restoration techniques for a client project, but we'd also used the trip as an opportunity to explore our compatibility during extended time together, and every photo captured moments of genuine partnership as we wandered through squares discussing architecture, shared meals at restaurants we'd researched together, and collaborated on identifying buildings that successfully balanced historic preservation with modern environmental needs. Nicole later told mutual friends that seeing those vacation photos had been like looking at an alternate version of her own life, the one where she trusted her own feelings instead of allowing herself to be manipulated by people who clearly didn't want her to be truly happy with someone who valued her for reasons beyond her appearance and social status. She realized that my supposed boring tendencies had actually been evidence of emotional maturity and genuine care for building something lasting rather than just exciting, and that the steady reliability her friends had criticized was exactly what she'd needed but had been too influenced by their chaos-driven perspective to properly appreciate when she'd had the chance. The photos showed Claire and me working together on a puzzle at our bed and breakfast, examining architectural details with shared enthusiasm, and generally existing as equal partners who enhanced each other's experiences rather than one person performing for the other's entertainment or financial support, which was a dynamic Nicole was beginning to understand she'd never experienced with any of the exciting men her friends had encouraged her to pursue since our breakup. She began questioning not just the museum intervention but every relationship opinion they'd ever offered, recognizing that their track record consisted entirely of failed relationships and bitter complaints about men who'd treated them poorly, while they'd systematically convinced her to reject the one man who'd actually demonstrated genuine love and commitment through consistent actions rather than just temporary excitement and expensive gifts that ultimately meant nothing when the initial thrill wore off and real life demanded actual partnership skills and emotional maturity from both people involved. 3 years after leaving Austin and everything connected to that painful chapter of my life, I proposed to Claire during a sunset sailing trip we'd planned together on Charleston Harbor, and she enthusiastically said yes before we'd even dropped anchor, laughing with pure joy as she examined the vintage Art Deco ring I'd chosen specifically because it reflected her sophisticated taste rather than following some generic expectation about what engagement rings should look like. We celebrated privately that evening with champagne on my sailboat while watching the city lights reflect on the water, then spent the following week calling our respective families and close friends who universally supported our union and expressed genuine happiness for two people who so clearly complemented each other's strengths and shared compatible visions for building a life together. Our engagement photos, taken by a photographer friend from the sailing club, captured two people who looked completely comfortable and natural together, laughing over inside jokes and working as a seamless team to adjust sails and navigate the harbor, and our wedding planning process reflected our shared values about sustainability, intimacy, and meaningful celebration rather than expensive spectacle designed primarily for social media documentation. When Nicole saw our engagement announcement through the interconnected web of mutual college connections and Austin acquaintances who'd followed both our paths over the years, she realized with devastating clarity that I'd found exactly what we could have had together if she'd possessed the courage to trust her own feelings instead of surrendering her judgment to friends whose jealous interference had cost her the most genuine relationship of her life. Her remaining friends' reaction to the news was tellingly defensive and bitter, as they immediately started making snide comments about rebound marriages, criticizing Claire's appearance in the engagement photos, and insisting that my obvious happiness was probably just performative overcompensation for still being heartbroken about Nicole. But their transparent discomfort and desperate attempts at dismissal only revealed their own guilt about destroying something beautiful for no valid reason. Beyond their own misery and need for control, Sarah made particularly nasty comments about Claire looking like a boring librarian type who probably didn't know how to have fun, while Jessica suggested that I'd obviously chosen someone completely different from Nicole as a way of punishing all women for Nicole's rejection, and Amanda, who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the group's toxicity, finally snapped and told them they needed to accept responsibility for sabotaging Nicole's happiness instead of continuing to tear down everyone else's success as a way of avoiding their own accountability. The confrontation escalated into explosive arguments that had been brewing for months, with Nicole finally finding the courage to directly confront her so-called friends about their consistent pattern of sabotaging her relationships whenever a man treated her well and offered genuine stability, pointing out that they'd never criticized the string of exciting but ultimately destructive men who'd treated her poorly after our breakup, only the one guy who'd actually loved her enough to plan a thoughtful proposal and commission custom artwork celebrating their relationship. She accused them of never wanting her to be truly happy because her contentment threatened their shared narrative that all relationships were disappointing and that women needed to stick together against men who would inevitably let them down, and she realized they'd been using her as emotional validation for their own bitter perspectives rather than genuinely caring about her well-being or personal growth. The friendship group that had once seemed so supportive and protective finally revealed itself as fundamentally destructive, built on competition, resentment, and a toxic need to ensure that none of them achieved the kind of stable happiness that would make the others feel left behind or force them to examine their own self-destructive relationship patterns. Nicole ended several of these friendships permanently during heated confrontations where years of suppressed resentment and manipulation finally came to the surface, and she began the difficult process of rebuilding her social circle around people who actually wanted her to succeed rather than subtly undermining her confidence and decision-making abilities under the guise of protection and concern. Meanwhile, Claire and I were busy planning a wedding that reflected our personalities and values, choosing a small ceremony at a restored plantation venue outside Charleston that specialized in sustainable event planning. And our guest list consisted entirely of people who genuinely celebrated our partnership rather than attending out of social obligation or hidden motives to create drama and gossip about our relationship choices and future plans together. Claire and I had the most beautiful wedding ceremony at Magnolia Grove, a meticulously restored 1850s plantation venue outside Charleston that had been converted into a showcase for sustainable event planning and historic preservation. Surrounded by 60 close friends and family members who genuinely celebrated our partnership and shared vision for building both a marriage and a collaborative architecture firm specializing in environmentally conscious design. The ceremony itself took place in the venue's original garden pavilion, which had been carefully restored using reclaimed materials and solar-powered lighting systems, and Claire wore her grandmother's vintage lace dress that she'd had professionally cleaned and slightly altered to reflect her own style while honoring family tradition in a way that felt meaningful rather than obligatory. Our vows focused on promises to support each other's professional dreams while building a personal partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine friendship, and we exchanged rings made from recycled gold by a local artisan who specialized in sustainable jewelry design that reflected our commitment to environmental responsibility in all aspects of our life together. The reception featured locally sourced food from farms within 50 miles of the venue, wines from Virginia vineyards that practiced organic agriculture, and decorations made entirely from native plants and flowers that could be composted after the celebration, creating a beautiful event that aligned perfectly with our values while providing our guests with an evening of authentic celebration rather than expensive spectacle designed primarily for social media documentation. Our honeymoon involved sailing the Greek islands for 3 weeks while researching traditional building techniques that incorporated natural cooling and heating systems into Mediterranean architecture, perfectly combining our professional interests with romantic adventure as we explored ancient villages and documented construction methods that could be adapted for modern sustainable design projects back home in Charleston. 5 years after that devastating night at the Contemporary Art Museum in Austin, Nicole finally found the courage to send a heartfelt handwritten letter to my parents' address, asking them to pass along her sincere apology for how our relationship had ended and taking complete responsibility for choosing her friend's jealous manipulation over her own happiness and genuine feelings about our 3-year partnership. In the letter, she explained that she was finally in therapy working through her people-pleasing tendencies and had completely cut contact with the toxic friends who had sabotaged multiple relationships over the years, slowly rebuilding her life around her own values and authentic desires rather than constantly seeking approval from others whose advice had consistently led her toward disappointment and regret. She expressed genuine joy for my successful marriage to someone who clearly appreciated and supported the qualities that her former friends had convinced her were boring and inadequate, and she acknowledged that she'd learned too late the difference between exciting dysfunction and mature love built on compatibility, shared goals, and mutual respect for each other's individual growth and professional ambitions. Nicole had apparently spent considerable time reflecting on our relationship and recognizing that my thoughtful approach to planning and commitment had actually been evidence of genuine love and emotional investment rather than the controlling behavior her friends had convinced her to fear. And she'd finally understood that stability and reliability were valuable qualities that created the foundation for lasting happiness rather than obstacles to personal growth and adventure. The letter was gracious and mature, acknowledging the pain she'd caused without asking for forgiveness or suggesting any possibility of renewed contact, simply expressing her hope that I'd found the happiness and appreciation I deserved with someone who valued partnership over performance and genuine connection over social approval and external validation from people who had no investment in our actual well-being. I received the letter while Claire and I were designing our dream home with an attached workshop where she could develop renewable energy prototypes while I drafted architectural plans for our growing firm, and after discussing it together over dinner, we decided that Nicole's growth and accountability deserved acknowledgement even though we needed to maintain appropriate boundaries given our new life and shared future plans. Claire suggested that my sister Emma should send a brief note on our behalf, thanking Nicole for her honesty and maturity while wishing her well in her continued journey towards self-advocacy and authentic relationships. And the response was carefully crafted to acknowledge her letter without opening any doors for further communication that might complicate our marriage or give Nicole false hope about rekindling something that had ended definitively years ago. Emma's note was warm but clear, expressing that we appreciated Nicole's apology and genuine happiness about her personal growth while making it obvious that we'd moved forward completely and built a life that didn't include space for revisiting past relationships, even ones that had ended due to outside interference rather than fundamental incompatibility between the actual people involved.